Megan appeared one rainy evening at the door of La Tavola di Firenze, a charming, warmly lit Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago. Her arrival went almost unnoticed, her small figure cloaked by a damp, oversized hoodie. She stood in the doorway, looking hesitant, as if she weren't sure she belonged here. Inside, the buzz of conversations and the clinking of glasses created a cozy atmosphere. The aromas of garlic and basil filled the air, as chefs in the open kitchen skillfully prepared their dishes. Ryan, the assistant chef, noticed her first. He was taking a quick break from his station and glanced at the entrance, where he spotted Megan, standing almost as if waiting for permission to enter. Something about her struck him, a mix of innocence and determination, along with a hint of something he couldn't quite identify. She looked lost, and yet her eyes held a glimmer of resilience. Ryan approached her cautiously. "Hey there, are you lost?" he asked, kneeling slightly to be at her level. Megan looked at him and shook her head slowly, holding his gaze with a quiet intensity. "Are you here with anyone?" he continued, glancing around to see if she was with an adult. She hesitated, then spoke in a small voice. "I'm here. I heard people sing here sometimes. I wanted to try." Ryan blinked, taken aback. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, and she wanted to sing? "You want to sing? Here? At La Tavola?" he asked, his tone gentle but a bit surprised. She nodded, shifting her weight nervously, glancing at the patrons who were beginning to notice her presence. "All right," Ryan said, sensing something unique about her. "Why not? Let's give you a shot." He led her carefully to a small makeshift stage where the restaurant sometimes hosted live performances. The guests looked at the young girl with curiosity, some whispering among themselves, but Megan seemed unfazed by the attention. She stood in the spotlight, her small frame casting a timid shadow, her eyes closed as if drawing strength from within. Ryan leaned over to her and whispered, "What's your name?" "Megan," she whispered back, just loud enough for him to hear. With a nod, Ryan gave her a soft encouragement. "Whenever you're ready, Megan." The restaurant grew silent, all eyes on this small figure in oversized clothes. Megan took a deep breath, the kind that seemed to come from somewhere deep, as if she was pulling out every ounce of courage she had. Then, in a voice delicate yet striking, she began to sing. Her voice was clear, pure, and hauntingly beautiful, filling the room with a sound that was both fragile and powerful, leaving the audience spellbound. As the first notes floated through the air, there was a collective intake of breath among the diners. Some patrons exchanged glances, while others simply closed their eyes, letting her voice wash over them. Megan's voice seemed to touch each person in a different way, resonating deep within, stirring emotions that words alone couldn't reach. As Megan's voice soared through the restaurant, her song stirred something deep and unexpected within everyone present. She sang with a vulnerability and an emotion that felt like it came from a much older soul, as if each note carried a lifetime of stories. Her voice was soft yet intense, rising and falling with perfect, natural control that seemed almost impossible for a child her age. For a moment, even the waitstaff paused to listen, their movements slowing to a standstill as they were captivated by her song. At one table near the stage, an older couple held hands, both their eyes misty as they watched and listened. They were reminded of their own daughter, who had passed away years ago but had once sung with a similar passion. Across the room, a young man who had been focused on his phone put it down, entranced, and felt a pang of longing he hadn't known was there. Parents with young children leaned in closer, listening as though Megan's voice held a secret only they could understand. Ryan watched from the kitchen entrance, his arms crossed and his heart pounding unexpectedly. There was something truly magical about Megan's voice. It seemed to have the power to reach into people's hearts and make them feel vulnerable, exposed. Ryan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for taking the risk and letting her sing. She had transformed the atmosphere of the restaurant, and everyone felt it. As her song drew to a close, Megan's voice softened, her eyes still closed as if she were somewhere far away. Her last note lingered in the air, a sweet, haunting echo that left a silence hanging over the room. No one dared to move. There was a moment when everyone collectively held their breath, afraid that any sound would break the spell she had woven around them. Then, slowly, applause started to ripple through the room, building and growing until the entire restaurant was clapping, some diners even standing. Megan's eyes fluttered open, and a shy, surprised smile spread across her face. It was as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone appreciate her performance. Ryan approached her, a wide smile breaking across his face. "Megan, that was incredible," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You've got a gift, kid." A few patrons came up to congratulate her, some even leaving cash tips on a small plate Ryan had quickly placed at the edge of the stage. Megan looked at the money, her eyes wide. She seemed surprised, unsure of what to do with it. "That's for you," Ryan explained, nudging the plate toward her. "People want to thank you for that performance." Megan looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. Thank you." As the customers returned to their tables, still buzzing with excitement over what they just experienced, one man lingered at the back, watching her with a particularly intense gaze. He was well-dressed, slightly older than most of the diners, with an air of quiet authority about him. Thomas Bennett, a wealthy businessman known in Chicago, had come to the restaurant for a quiet dinner, but Megan's voice had completely captured his attention. He stood there, his eyes fixed on her, a strange expression on his face as if he'd just seen a ghost. As Ryan helped Megan gather the cash on the plate, he noticed Thomas's gaze and felt a chill. There was something about the man's expression that hinted at more than just admiration. It was a look of recognition mixed with a hint of regret, perhaps even pain. Thomas Bennett stood in the dimly lit corner of the restaurant, his gaze still fixed on Megan. He watched her closely, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. While the other patrons had returned to their meals, smiling and talking excitedly about the young girl's performance, Thomas remained rooted to the spot, as if frozen by the memories that Megan's voice had stirred in him. From where he stood, Thomas clenched his fists, his usually calm demeanor slipping. Something about Megan, the delicate rise and fall of her notes, the way she closed her eyes as if lost in another world, had struck him deeply. For a fleeting moment, he could almost imagine himself transported back in time to a long-buried memory of a voice singing the very same song, a voice he hadn't heard in years. As he struggled to maintain his composure, he remembered his daughter, the daughter he hadn't seen since she was a baby. She had disappeared with her mother, his ex-wife. After a painful and bitter separation, he'd spent years searching, exhausting every option, but they had vanished without a trace. After so much heartbreak, he had finally forced himself to let go, to accept that he would never see her again. Yet here he was, watching this young girl on the small stage of an Italian restaurant, and it was as though that voice had called his past back to life. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, the faint sound of Megan's song echoing in his mind, pulling him back to a time when he would sing that same lullaby to a baby girl who looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Trying to shake off the memory, Thomas opened his eyes and took a few cautious steps toward Megan. He didn't know what he was feeling, or even why he was drawn to her so strongly. All he knew was that he had to know more about her. There was a pull he couldn't ignore, a need to unravel the mystery of why this stranger's voice felt so heartbreakingly familiar. Ryan noticed Thomas approaching and stepped in protectively. "Can I help you with something?" Ryan asked, his tone polite but cautious. Thomas met Ryan's gaze, his expression a mix of tension and something almost vulnerable. "That girl, the one who sang," Thomas said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Where did she come from? Does she perform here often?" Ryan, sensing the strange intensity behind Thomas's questions, hesitated before responding. "She doesn't. In fact, tonight was her first time here. I'm not even sure where she lives. She just showed up tonight and asked to sing." Thomas's face betrayed a flicker of surprise. "She just showed up? Alone?" Ryan nodded, glancing over at Megan, who was gathering the few crumpled bills that the patrons had left for her on the plate. She looked up and caught Thomas's gaze, her eyes widening slightly at the intensity of his stare. She held his gaze for a moment, her expression uncertain, as if she were trying to understand why this stranger was so focused on her. Thomas felt a sudden urge to turn away, to hide the emotions that Megan's song had unearthed. But he couldn't. He took a step closer, his voice softer now, as if he were afraid of frightening her. "Young lady, Megan, is it?" he asked, his voice betraying a rare vulnerability. Megan nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You have a remarkable voice," he said, struggling to maintain his composure. It reminds me of someone I used to know." Megan nodded again, a shy smile crossing her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, glancing down at her shoes. Thomas took a breath, his mind racing as he debated his next words. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so much he wanted to understand, but he knew that pressing her too hard might scare her away. Instead, he chose his words carefully. Do you live nearby?" Megan looked up at Ryan, who seemed to silently encourage her to answer. "I live close enough," she replied, her voice hesitant. "It's just me. My mom, she's gone." Thomas felt a pang of empathy as he heard her words. He wondered how much loss and hardship this young girl had faced at such a tender age. There was a connection between them now, a fragile bond woven from shared pain and loneliness, though neither of them could fully understand it yet. Just then, a soft, unsteady breath escaped Thomas's lips, and he realized he was holding back tears. Embarrassed, he straightened, offering her a nod. "Thank you for your song, Megan. It meant more to me than you know." Without waiting for her reply, he turned and walked toward the exit, his mind reeling, his heart heavy with memories and questions that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Thomas pushed open the heavy door of the restaurant and stepped into the chilly night air, but he barely felt the cold against his skin. His mind was spinning, lost in memories and emotions that he thought he'd buried long ago. He could still hear the faint echo of Megan's voice in his mind, a voice that brought back a different time, one of both joy and pain. It had been years since he had last thought about his daughter's disappearance in such vivid detail, yet here he was, unable to escape the images flashing through his mind. He walked along the dimly lit sidewalk, taking long, deliberate strides, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Every now and then, he'd stop and glance back at the restaurant as if he might see her again, that small girl with the familiar voice that had somehow reopened old wounds. He shook his head, feeling foolish, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Could it be possible that this girl, this young stranger who looked so much like a child he'd once held in his arms, was connected to him in a way he couldn't understand? He stopped at the corner, his heart pounding, and allowed himself to face the possibility. It wasn't just her voice, but the song she had chosen, a lullaby he had sung countless times to his daughter, a melody so particular and so unique that he couldn't imagine anyone else knowing it. And her eyes. Thomas closed his own eyes, remembering the wide, innocent gaze of his little girl. Megan's eyes had held that same haunting, vulnerable look, one that had nearly broken him as he stood in front of her. It all felt impossible, absurd even, but something inside him whispered that it wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps he was fooling himself, or perhaps he was just too lonely and desperate for hope. But whatever the case, Thomas knew he couldn't let it go. He had to know more about her. The next day, Thomas found himself back at La Tavola di Firenze before the lunch rush, sitting at a quiet corner table, his eyes darting to the entrance every few moments. He hadn't been able to sleep the night before, his mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. He didn't know how he would approach Megan, or even if she would show up again. But he had to try. He needed to know more, to uncover if there was any truth to the idea that had taken hold of him. As he waited, Ryan came over, holding a menu, but the young chef's eyes were watchful. "Can I get you something, Mr. Bennett?" he asked politely, though there was a subtle edge to his tone. Thomas shook his head, glancing up at Ryan with a tight smile. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his voice steady, though his mind was anything but. He knew Ryan had been protective of Megan, and he respected that. It was part of why he felt the need to explain himself. After a pause, Thomas gestured for Ryan to sit. Reluctantly, Ryan took a seat across from him, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. "I know this might seem odd," Thomas began, choosing his words carefully, but I was hoping you could tell me a bit more about the girl who sang here last night.
Megan.
Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded, as if expecting this question. She just showed up out of the blue, Ryan said slowly, studying Thomas's face. Didn't have much to say about herself. She's just a kid, Mr. Bennett. She didn't mention any family or guardians, and it sounds like she's on her own. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest at those words. He struggled to keep his voice steady as he asked, "She's alone? No family at all?" Ryan shook his head, watching Thomas closely. She said her mother passed away recently. Didn't say anything about a father. I don't think she has anyone. He hesitated, glancing at Thomas with a flicker of sympathy. You seemed pretty affected by her song last night. I take it she reminded you of someone? Thomas felt a lump form in his throat as he nodded. Yes, he admitted quietly, his voice strained. She reminded me of someone I lost. Someone I've been searching for a very long time. Ryan didn't press him for more details, but his expression softened, as if understanding that there were layers of pain and hope behind Thomas's words. If it helps, I don't think she's looking for trouble, Ryan said, his voice gentler now. She just wanted to sing. Maybe it's her way of surviving. Thomas nodded, grateful for Ryan's insight. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, almost painful hope that maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. He stood up, his decision clear now. Thank you, he said, reaching out to shake Ryan's hand. If she comes back, if she ever needs anything, will you let her know that I'd like to help? She may not understand, but it's important to me. Ryan nodded, a look of understanding passing between them. I'll make sure she knows. As Thomas left the restaurant, his heart pounded with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Megan was out there somewhere, and he was determined to find her again. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he was willing to face any challenge, to uncover the truth about Megan, and to see if somehow, against all odds, she was the family he thought he had lost forever. That evening, Ryan found himself glancing at the entrance of the restaurant more often than usual, wondering if Megan would show up again. After his conversation with Thomas, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much deeper connecting the two of them. He had sensed it in Thomas's voice, a mix of hope and desperation, and it made him feel responsible for whatever was unfolding. He didn't know much about Megan, but he couldn't ignore the sense that her presence here wasn't just a coincidence. Hours passed, and just as the restaurant was settling into a quiet lull, the door opened and Megan slipped in. She was quiet, almost trying to disappear into the shadows, but Ryan spotted her instantly. She looked tired, her eyes a little red, her clothes slightly more worn than he remembered. It was clear she'd been through a rough day. Ryan approached her gently, not wanting to startle her. "Hey, Megan," he greeted, his voice warm. "Back for another song?" Megan managed a faint smile, looking down at her hands. "If that's okay," she murmured. "People liked it yesterday. I thought maybe—" "Of course, it's okay," Ryan reassured her, guiding her toward the small stage again. "People would love to hear you sing again. Besides, it seems like singing makes you happy." Megan nodded slowly, though her expression remained distant, as if her mind were somewhere else. Ryan watched her for a moment, a sense of protectiveness growing inside him. He knelt down to her level. "Megan, if you ever need to talk, or if you need anything, just let me know, okay?" Her eyes flicked to his face, and for a second, he thought she might open up. But then she looked away, a shadow passing over her features. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I'm okay." Ryan nodded, understanding that she wasn't ready to share. "All right. Well, go ahead and sing when you're ready. We'll be listening." As she took her place on the stage, Megan closed her eyes, and once again, her voice filled the restaurant. This time, her song was slower, more haunting. The melody was different, but the feeling was the same. A deep sadness that reached into the hearts of everyone listening. People stopped eating, their conversations fading as her voice wove a spell over the room. There was a quiet power in her singing, an ability to make people feel as if she were speaking directly to their souls. In the kitchen, Ryan continued to watch her, but his mind drifted to Thomas Bennett. He remembered the way the man had looked at Megan, that intense recognition mixed with something close to grief. And now, seeing Megan on the stage, singing with such raw emotion, Ryan felt more convinced than ever that there was a connection between them, something that neither of them had fully understood yet. When Megan finished her song, the audience applauded, a few patrons wiping tears from their eyes. Megan looked up, a bit startled by the applause, as though she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. She offered a shy, grateful smile, then quickly stepped down from the stage, retreating toward the back of the restaurant. As she made her way to the exit, Ryan intercepted her gently. "Hold on, Megan," he said softly. "Can we talk for a second?" She looked at him, a bit wary, but nodded. Ryan crouched down to her level, choosing his words carefully. "There was a man here last night," he began, watching her reaction closely. "He heard you sing, and well, he seemed really moved. Said you reminded him of someone he lost." Megan's face softened, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Who was he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "His name's Thomas Bennett," Ryan replied. "He's a businessman here in Chicago." But Megan, the way he looked at you, it was like he was seeing someone he'd been searching for. Megan lowered her gaze, hugging her arms around herself. She was silent for a moment, then she looked up at Ryan with a mixture of confusion and sadness. "I don't know him," she murmured. "I don't know anyone." Ryan felt a pang of sympathy. It was clear that Megan carried more than her share of burdens for a girl her age. He wanted to protect her, to find some way to help her, but he also knew that she would only open up if she was ready. He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Listen, Megan," he said softly. "If you ever need help, or if you ever feel alone, you can come here. I mean it. And if you'd like, I can introduce you to Thomas. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I think it could help him and maybe even help you." Megan's eyes filled with uncertainty. She nodded slowly, but her expression remained guarded. Maybe I'll think about it," she whispered, glancing toward the door as though ready to slip away again. Ryan smiled encouragingly. "All right, just remember that you have people who care. You're not alone, Megan." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something close to hope. "Thank you, Ryan," she said quietly. With a final glance around the restaurant, Megan turned and slipped out the door, disappearing into the night. As Ryan watched her go, he felt a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that he was part of something important, something that could change lives. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He would be there for Megan, no matter what. And he hoped, with all his heart, that someday she would find the answers she was searching for. After a restless night haunted by memories and unanswered questions, Thomas knew he had to find out more about Megan. His heart told him there was something too familiar, too unexplainable in her voice and presence. He couldn't keep away from the truth that tugged at him. So the next morning, Thomas was on a mission. He needed answers, and he was determined to do whatever it took to get them. First, he reached out to Ryan at La Vola di Firenze, hoping to uncover anything he could about Megan's background. He dialed the restaurant, pacing around his office as he waited for someone to pick up. Finally, Ryan answered. "Ryan, this is Thomas Bennett," he said, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, but Ryan's tone was understanding. "How can I help, Mr. Bennett?" Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's about Megan. I don't know why, but I feel like she could be someone I lost a long time ago. I know it sounds strange, but I can't shake the feeling. Is there any way you can tell me more about her? Where she's from, how she got here?" Ryan hesitated, clearly weighing his response. "I can't say I know much, Mr. Bennett," he admitted. "She came to the restaurant out of nowhere, and from what she told me, she's been on her own since her mother passed away recently. I don't think she has any family." Thomas's heart clenched at those words, the pain of his own past rushing back. "Is there anything else you know? Did she mention where she used to live, or anything about her mother?" Ryan hesitated again, but something in Thomas's voice must have convinced him to go on. "She did say her mother passed away not too long ago. I didn't pry, but it sounded like she'd been moving around a lot, like she didn't have anywhere stable to go after that. Thomas felt a sinking realization settling into his chest. If Megan had been wandering alone after her mother's death, it was possible she'd been overlooked, slipping through the cracks of a system that should have helped her. He tried to process what Ryan was saying, but his mind kept returning to a single thought. This young girl was all alone, just like his daughter might have been. "Thank you, Ryan," Thomas finally said, his voice heavy. "If she comes by again, could you let me know? I'd like to help her in whatever way I can." Ryan agreed, his voice soft with understanding. "I'll make sure she knows, Mr. Bennett. She's a special kid. I think she'd appreciate knowing there's someone out there who cares." Later that day, Thomas found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out a box hidden deep within his closet, a box filled with photos, letters, and keepsakes from the brief years he'd spent with his daughter and her mother. Inside, he found a small, delicate photo of his daughter as a baby. Her eyes were wide and curious, her little face full of life and innocence. He sat on the floor, holding the photo, a heavy silence filling the room. How many years had it been? Too many, he thought, his heart aching with the lost time. The what-ifs that haunted him every day. If Megan really was his daughter, if there was even the smallest chance, he would do whatever it took to bring her back into his life. But for now, he needed to be sure. He needed answers. Days passed, and each evening, he returned to La Vola, hoping to catch a glimpse of Megan. He watched as customers came and went, his gaze lingering on each young face that passed through the doors. But Megan didn't appear, and with each passing day, his hope began to wane. Then, one evening, Ryan approached his table with a determined expression. "Mr. Bennett, I've been asking around," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Megan didn't leave much behind, but I found out she's been staying in a shelter downtown. They have a policy of not sharing too much about the kids there, but I managed to learn that Megan comes and goes as she pleases. She's there some nights, gone the others." Thomas nodded, a spark of hope reigniting in his chest. "Do you think they'd let me talk to her? Just to see if I can help her?" Ryan shrugged. "It's worth a try, but they'll be protective. She's just a kid, after all, and they want to keep her safe." Thomas thanked Ryan again, more determined than ever. The next morning, he drove down to the shelter, his heart pounding as he parked outside. The building was modest, tucked between two larger, run-down structures, with a small sign marking it as the Second Chance Center. He took a deep breath, straightened his coat, and stepped inside. A woman at the front desk looked up as he entered, her expression both welcoming and guarded. "Good morning," she said, offering a polite smile. "How can I help you?" Thomas introduced himself, explaining that he was looking for a young girl named Megan. He didn't mention his suspicions about their connection, unsure how much to reveal without sounding foolish. The woman listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his story. "Mr. Bennett, we have a duty to protect the privacy and safety of the children here," she explained gently. "Megan does come and go, as you mentioned, but we can't share any details about her without her consent." Thomas nodded, understanding their position, but feeling frustrated nonetheless. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, his voice steady but pleading. "But if there's any way I could meet her, just once, to talk, I think it would mean a lot. I've been searching for someone for a very long time, and I have reason to believe that Megan might be that person." The woman studied him, her expression softening as she seemed to pick up on the sincerity in his voice. "I can't promise anything," she said slowly, "but I can let her know you're looking for her. If she wants to meet you, we'll make it happen." Thomas thanked her, relief flooding through him. "That's all I asked." As he left the shelter, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the tiniest flicker of hope sparking within him. He knew he would wait as long as it took, hoping that one day Megan would be ready to hear his story and maybe, just maybe, find a place in his life. Until then, he would hold on to that hope, no matter how fragile it seemed. After leaving the shelter, Thomas spent the next several days caught between hope and fear. He found himself glancing at his phone every hour, checking for missed calls or messages, waiting for any sign that Megan had agreed to meet him. Every night, he lay awake, thinking about the possibility of her being his daughter, imagining the moment they might finally sit down face to face. It was a strange feeling, part excitement, part terror. What if she wasn't his daughter? And perhaps even more frightening, what if she was? By the end of the week, just as the first signs of doubt began creeping into his mind, his phone buzzed in the early hours of a quiet Saturday morning. The message was short, but it filled him with a nervous energy that jolted him awake. Megan agreed to meet with you. She'll be at the shelter tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon. The text read, sent by the shelter coordinator. Thomas read it twice, his pulse racing. She had agreed. He had one day to prepare, to gather himself, and to make sure he was ready for whatever this meeting might bring. The rest of that day passed in a blur of nerves and anticipation. He couldn't focus on work, on his calls, or on the endless responsibilities that normally occupied his days. Everything felt distant and unimportant compared to what lay ahead. The next day, he arrived at the shelter a little before 3, his heart thudding with a mix of hope and apprehension. The shelter looked just as modest as it had before, a quiet building with faded walls and chipped paint, but to Thomas, it held a kind of magic. Inside might be the answer to years of heartache and searching. The same woman from the front desk greeted him with a polite nod. She gestured toward a small, quiet room just off the main hall, a private space with a few chairs and a simple table. "She's waiting in there," she said softly. "Just remember, Mr. Bennett, go slow. She's been through a lot." Thomas took a deep breath, nodding in understanding. His hand shook slightly as he turned the doorknob and stepped inside. Megan sat by the window, her gaze focused somewhere outside, lost in thought. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile, though her posture held a quiet resilience. Her hair hung in soft waves around her face, and she wore the same oversized hoodie he'd seen her in that first night. For a moment, Thomas just looked at her, trying to reconcile the image of the girl before him with the baby he'd once held. She sensed his presence and turned to face him, her expression cautious but not fearful. She studied him, and he felt a wave of vulnerability wash over him, realizing he wasn't the only one filled with questions. "Hello, Megan," he said softly, his voice gentle as he took a seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Megan nodded, not breaking eye contact, her gaze steady but guarded. "The lady here said you wanted to talk. About something important." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't planned exactly what he'd say. All he knew was that he needed her to understand why he was here. "Yes," he said slowly, gathering his thoughts. "I don't want to scare you, Megan, or make you uncomfortable. I know you probably have a lot of questions, but I have some too." She looked at him intently, as if trying to read him, to decide whether or not she could trust him. "Why me? Why did you ask to meet with me?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but direct. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words before he spoke. "Because a long time ago, I lost someone very important to me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "My daughter. When I saw you, when I heard you sing that night, I can't explain it, but something felt familiar. Your voice, the song. Everything about you reminded me of her." Megan's expression softened just a fraction, though she still looked cautious. "You think I'm your daughter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, not wanting to overwhelm her. "I don't know," he admitted, his eyes searching hers for any hint of recognition. "But I have to find out. I've been searching for so long, Megan, and maybe I'm wrong. But if there's even a small chance." Megan looked down at her hands, fiddling with the sleeves of her hoodie. "I don't remember much about my dad," she said quietly. "My mom didn't talk about him. I asked her once, but she looked sad and said he was gone." She paused, glancing up at him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Why did you lose her? Your daughter, I mean." Thomas felt his chest tighten. The question was simple, but the answer held years of regret and longing. "I loved her mother very much, but we separated when she was young. Her mother left with her, and I tried to find them. I really did. But for years, it was like they had vanished." His voice broke, and he looked away, struggling to regain his composure. "I thought I'd lost her forever." Megan's expression softened, her eyes filling with a mixture of empathy and curiosity. For a moment, there was a shared silence between them, a quiet understanding that came from years of longing on both sides. She looked at him, a question lingering in her gaze. "What would you do if I was your daughter?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas felt a surge of emotions rise within him, hope and fear mingling in a way he hadn't expected. If you are, he corrected himself, his voice trembling slightly. "I would do everything I could to make up for lost time. I would make sure you never felt alone again. I would be there for you, however you needed." Megan's eyes shimmered with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't know who my dad is," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I used to imagine he'd come find me one day, like in those stories. But after a while, I stopped hoping." Thomas felt his heart break a little at her words. He reached across the table, his hand hovering, not wanting to startle her. "You don't have to hope alone, Megan," he said gently. "Whether or not I'm the person you're looking for, I'd like to help you. I'd like to be here if you'll let me." She stared at his hand for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, she reached out, letting her small hand rest in his. The moment felt fragile, like holding a piece of glass that could shatter with the wrong movement. But he held her hand gently, his heart filled with a cautious, fragile hope. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "maybe we can find out together." Thomas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that," he replied, feeling a surge of hope he hadn't felt in years. "I'd like that very much." They sat together in that small room, hand in hand, two souls searching for answers that lay somewhere in their shared past. For the first time in years, Thomas felt that maybe, just maybe, he was on the brink of something beautiful and unexpected, something he had long thought was lost forever. As days passed, Thomas and Megan began to see each other regularly, each meeting carefully orchestrated and watched over by the staff at the shelter. Their conversations started out slow and cautious, with Thomas careful not to press Megan on her past. They kept things light, discussing favorite foods, stories, and music. Yet, in every moment, an unspoken question lingered between them, one that neither had the courage to ask outright. One day, after a shared lunch of sandwiches and tea at a quiet park near the shelter, Megan looked up at Thomas, a mix of curiosity and hesitation in her eyes. "What do you remember most about your daughter?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Thomas paused, struck by the question. He looked out at the trees swaying in the breeze, gathering his thoughts before answering. "It's hard to pick just one thing," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "She was so young, a baby really, but I remember the way she'd look at me with these wide eyes, always watching, as if she were trying to understand the world. She'd grip my finger with all her strength, like she never wanted to let go." His voice faltered, and he looked down, a distant sadness in his eyes. "I used to sing her a lullaby every night, just to watch her fall asleep." Megan listened intently, her gaze fixed on his face. "The lullaby? Was it the same one I sang that night at the restaurant?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, his eyes misting. "Yes, that's why I was so moved when I heard you sing it. I hadn't heard that song in so many years, and yet, it brought everything back." Megan looked away, as though processing his words. After a moment, she spoke, almost to herself. "My mom used to sing that song to me, too. She'd tell me it was a song to keep away the loneliness." Thomas felt a pang of sorrow at the words, a sense of shared heartache. He took a steadying breath, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It seems like we both know what it's like to miss someone," he said softly. Megan looked back at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you really think I could be your daughter?" she asked, her voice fragile, as though the question itself could shatter something precious inside her. He didn't answer right away, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, Megan, but every time I see you, every time I hear you sing or watch you smile, I feel like there's a part of me that recognizes you. I can't explain it, but it's like a piece of my heart that was missing has come back." She took in his words quietly, processing them with the same focused expression he had come to recognize. "If I am your daughter," she began, her voice trembling, "what would happen to us?" Thomas felt his heart tighten at the vulnerability in her question. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but filled with conviction. "Then, if you wanted, I would be there for you, Megan. We could take things one day at a time, whatever pace you feel comfortable with. I would never force anything, but I'd be there for you in every way that mattered." A tentative smile played on Megan's lips, and she nodded, seeming reassured. They sat together in silence for a moment, the unspoken possibility between them growing stronger with each passing day. A few days later, Megan met him again at the park, her expression more serious than usual. She had spent days thinking about their conversations, her mind full of questions and doubts. But there was one memory that kept coming back to her, one she couldn't shake. She sat beside Thomas on the park bench, watching the leaves fall around them. "Thomas," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the ground, "I think I remember something." Thomas turned to her, his heart beating faster. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping she might reveal something, anything, that would help them understand. "What do you remember?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath, her eyes distant as though she were looking back through the years. "It's just flashes, really. But I remember a man with a kind face, singing to me. I don't know if it's real, or if I just want it to be real, but he had a voice like yours." Thomas swallowed, emotions welling up inside him. "And what else?" he encouraged softly, hoping she would continue. Megan closed her eyes, as if focusing helped bring the memories into sharper view. "I remember being held, feeling safe. I think I remember a soft blanket and the smell of coffee in the mornings. It's not much, but it feels familiar." She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his, a mix of hope and confusion. "Could that really be you?" Thomas's hand reached for hers, a silent affirmation that he, too, felt the same familiar connection. "Megan," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I would give anything for that to be true." They sat there, holding hands as the sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the steady thumping of their hearts. Thomas knew he would need to take this slowly, to let her come to him at her own pace, but he also knew that he wouldn't give up. Not now, not after everything they'd shared. Then, as the days continued, Thomas quietly began his own investigation into Megan's past. He wanted to respect her privacy, but he also needed to know if she was indeed the daughter he had lost. He reached out to contacts he hadn't spoken to in years, hiring a private investigator to search for records, birth certificates, and anything that could connect the dots. He kept these efforts private, not wanting to put pressure on Megan until he was certain. Every time they met, he found himself observing her more closely. The way she laughed, the small quirks in her expressions, the way she seemed to unconsciously mirror some of his own mannerisms. It felt like they shared an unspoken bond, something deeper than words. And then, after weeks of waiting, Thomas received a call from the investigator late one night. He was told that a birth certificate had been located, and it included the names of both parents. When Thomas heard the mother's name, a name he hadn't spoken in so many years, he felt his legs go weak. "Mr. Bennett, it's very likely that Megan is your daughter," the investigator said, his tone cautious yet confident. Thomas sank into his chair, his hand covering his mouth as he struggled to process the words. He had found her. After all these years, he had found her. Tears welled in his eyes, and for a moment, he let himself feel the weight of all those years of searching, all those nights spent hoping, and all the pain he had buried deep inside. The next time he saw Megan, he felt a calm certainty he hadn't felt before. He knew he had to tell her, but he would do it gently, letting her set the pace. She arrived at their usual spot, sitting beside him on the park bench with her usual shy smile, though something in her gaze suggested she, too, sensed a change in him. "Megan," he began softly, turning to face her, his voice filled with both excitement and caution, "I need to tell you something. I had someone help me look into things, and it seems you might be my daughter." She looked at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. For a moment, she said nothing, and he feared he had overwhelmed her. But then, slowly, she reached out, taking his hand in hers with a look of determination. "I think I always knew," she whispered, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. I didn't want to hope too much, but I feel it too." Thomas pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her as they both took in the reality of what they had found. This time, he was sure he wouldn't lose her again. This time, they had each other, and together, they would begin a new journey, one that neither of them would ever face alone again. As the days turned into weeks, Megan and Thomas began the delicate process of building a life together. They took things slowly, neither wanting to rush the fragile connection they had rediscovered. For both of them, every moment was a mixture of discovery, joy, and sometimes even a bit of fear as they navigated their newfound relationship. Thomas made it a point to be there for Megan in every way he could, filling her days with small but meaningful gestures. He would pick her up from the shelter whenever she wanted, and they'd spend hours at his apartment, cooking meals together, learning to share the silence comfortably, and sometimes simply sitting on the couch with no words necessary. He made sure she knew she could rely on him, that he was there not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and a desire to be the father he had longed to be. One Saturday afternoon, as the chilly autumn winds began to pick up, Megan found herself standing outside Thomas's apartment, nervously shifting her weight. She had been staying at the shelter, and though she appreciated the care and security it offered, she felt something calling her elsewhere. She hesitated before knocking on the door, wondering if it was too soon to ask what had been weighing on her mind for days now. Thomas opened the door with a warm smile, immediately noticing her hesitant expression. "Megan, come on in," he said gently, ushering her inside and closing the door against the cold. He led her to the living room, offering her a cup of tea as they sat on the couch. They talked for a while, sharing stories from the week, but he sensed there was something else she wanted to say. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her eyes darting around the room before finally settling on his face. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to ask. "Thomas," she began slowly, "do you think maybe I could stay here, just for a little while?" Thomas's heart swelled at her words. He had been hoping she would ask, had even prepared the guest room for her, but he hadn't wanted to push, waiting for her to feel comfortable enough to bring it up herself. His smile was soft but filled with relief. "Of course, Megan," he replied, his voice gentle. "You can stay here as long as you'd like. This can be your home too, if you want." Her face softened with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, a slight tremor in her voice. I just didn't want to feel like a burden." Thomas reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not a burden, Megan," he said firmly. "You're my daughter, and you have a place here. I want you to feel safe, to feel at home." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's been a long time since I felt like I had a home," she admitted quietly. "Everything always felt temporary, like I couldn't let myself get too comfortable." Thomas's heart broke hearing this. He squeezed her shoulder, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "Then let's change that," he said softly. "Let's make this a place where you feel safe, a place where you know you belong." That evening, Thomas helped her settle into the guest room, which he had decorated with simple touches he thought she might like. There were soft blankets on the bed, a small bookshelf he'd filled with books he thought she might enjoy, and a few framed pictures of landscapes he hoped would bring a sense of calm. Megan looked around the room, her expression a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "You didn't have to do all this," she murmured, running her fingers over the soft bedspread. "I wanted to," he replied. "I wanted you to know that you're wanted here, Megan. Every single detail was chosen with you in mind." She turned to him, her eyes misty with unspoken emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. From that night on, life took on a new rhythm. Mornings became their own little ritual, with Thomas making breakfast as Megan joined him at the table, often still wrapped in the cozy warmth of her pajamas. He'd watch as she slowly opened up, her laughter coming more easily, her face brightening with each new day. They began to find joy in the smallest things, like trying out new recipes, laughing at silly kitchen mistakes, or simply enjoying a quiet breakfast together. One Saturday, Thomas suggested they go to the Chicago Art Institute, hoping to share one of his favorite places with her. Megan agreed, Her curiosity piqued. The grand halls and towering sculptures filled her with awe, and Thomas couldn't help but smile as he watched her take in each exhibit with wide-eyed wonder. She paused at a painting of a mother holding her child, her gaze lingering on it for a long time, as if lost in thought. He noticed her expression, a mixture of sorrow and longing, and instinctively reached for her hand, offering silent support. As they moved through the museum, Megan started sharing more about her mother, her memories fragmented but filled with love. She spoke about her mother's gentle smile, the lullabies she would hum, the way she would always find a way to make things feel special, even when they had little. Thomas listened quietly, his heart heavy with both sadness and gratitude for the woman who had raised his daughter when he couldn't. Afterward, as they strolled along Michigan Avenue, Megan grew quiet, a thoughtful look on her face. She turned to Thomas, her voice soft. "I used to wonder why my mom never talked about my dad," she said, almost to herself. She always said he was someone special, but she never explained why he wasn't there. Thomas's expression grew serious. He stopped walking and looked down at her, his voice gentle but filled with the weight of his regret. "I wish I had been there for you both, Megan," he said quietly. "There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about what I missed. But I'm here now, and I'll make up for every moment we lost." Megan nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. She seemed to take in his words, as though they were wrapping around her like a long-awaited embrace. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a family, of a father who loved her, and a home that was truly hers. That evening, they returned to Thomas's apartment, both exhausted yet content. They ordered pizza, eating straight from the box in the living room as they watched an old movie. Megan leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt as though the pieces of his life were finally falling into place. As the movie ended and the room grew quiet, Megan turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and hope. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, Do you think we can make this work? Being a family, I mean." Thomas's heart swelled at her words. He reached for her hand, his voice filled with conviction. "I know we can, Megan. It won't always be easy, but we'll figure it out together. We'll take it one step at a time." She gave him a small smile, her fingers curling around his. "I'd like that," she whispered, her voice steady. In that quiet moment, as they sat together in the glow of the television, Thomas felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. He knew there would be challenges ahead, memories to heal, and wounds to mend, but he also knew that they had each other. And for now, that was enough. Months passed, and the bond between Thomas and Megan grew stronger with each shared experience, each quiet moment, and every small memory they built together. The two had moved from strangers, tentatively sharing stories, to a family that leaned on each other, filling the empty spaces that had once defined them. For the first time, Megan felt a sense of stability, a place where she truly belonged, and for Thomas, each day felt like a second chance he was determined not to waste. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to blanket the sidewalks in shades of red and gold, Thomas had an idea. He wanted to show Megan a place that had long held a special meaning for him. After breakfast, he packed a small bag, grabbing blankets, a couple of thermoses filled with hot chocolate, and a few sandwiches. When Megan looked at him with a questioning smile, he simply winked. "Just a little surprise," he said, leading her outside. They drove through the winding roads leading out of the city, the buildings giving way to tall trees and rolling hills. After about an hour, they arrived at a secluded clearing that overlooked a small lake, surrounded by towering oaks and maples. Thomas parked the car, and they walked a short path until they reached a flat area where the water shimmered under the soft, morning light. Megan looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the serenity of the place touching her deeply. Thomas spread a blanket out on the ground, and they sat down, both gazing at the lake in comfortable silence. "I used to come here a lot," he admitted, his voice soft, "especially when I needed to think. Something about this place has always felt calming to me." Megan nodded, pulling her knees up to her chest, her gaze never leaving the water. After a few moments, she turned to him, a question in her eyes. Did you ever come here when you were looking for me? Thomas's breath caught. He looked down at the ground, memories flashing through his mind. Yes, he said slowly, the weight of those years evident in his voice. There were times when I felt like giving up, but I'd come here, sit for hours, and remind myself that if there was even a chance, I couldn't stop searching. He glanced at her, his expression both tender and solemn. It's strange, isn't it? Life took us down so many different roads, but somehow, we still found each other. Megan reached out, placing her hand over his. I'm glad you didn't give up, she murmured, her voice filled with gratitude. I think I was always waiting for you, even when I didn't know it. They sat together, hand in hand, their unspoken understanding filling the quiet air between them. For the first time, Thomas felt as though the years of searching, of loneliness, of wondering and waiting, had all been worth it. He had found his daughter, and though they could never reclaim the lost years, they had a future ahead of them, a future they would face together. As the morning wore on, Thomas reached into the bag and pulled out the sandwiches he had packed, passing one to Megan. She took it with a grin, grateful for the warmth and simplicity of the moment. They ate and laughed, telling stories that ranged from small daily happenings to childhood memories, each one a new piece in the tapestry of their lives together. At one point, Megan leaned back, her expression thoughtful. It's strange, she said quietly, how something as simple as sharing a sandwich can feel like everything I ever wanted. I spent so long feeling like I didn't belong anywhere, and now here we are, just being a family. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a gentle smile on his face. You'll always belong here, Megan. No matter where life takes us, we have each other now. That's what family is. The two of them sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sun rise higher in the sky. They felt a calmness settle over them, as if the world had granted them a rare moment of peace, untouched by the past, filled only with the warmth of the present and the promise of a future. Eventually, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake, they packed up and headed back toward the city. They shared the drive home in comfortable silence, each lost in their thoughts, yet feeling closer than ever. Back at Thomas's apartment that evening, Megan turned to him as they settled in for the night. Can we make this a tradition? She asked, her eyes bright with hope. Just us, every fall. A day by the lake. Thomas smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love. I would love that, Megan. Every fall, just us. As Megan headed toward her room, she paused at the door, glancing back at him with a shy smile. Good night, Dad, she whispered, the words slipping out naturally. Thomas's eyes softened, his throat tightening with emotion. It was the first time she had called him that, and hearing it filled him with a sense of completeness he hadn't known he was missing. Good night, sweetheart, he replied, his voice warm and steady. That night, as he lay in bed, Thomas reflected on how far they had come. He knew there would still be challenges, still moments of difficulty as they continued to learn about each other, but he felt ready. He was no longer the man lost in regret and sorrow. He was a father, and he had his daughter back. In the weeks that followed, their lives continued to intertwine in ways both big and small. Megan began to settle into school, and Thomas found himself more involved in her life than he had ever dared to hope. He helped her with homework, took her to school events, and even sat through her choir rehearsals, proudly watching her find her place among her peers. Each day brought new milestones, new memories. Megan began to call him Dad more often, and each time, it felt like a small victory, a reminder that they were healing together. Slowly, Megan let herself trust, let herself believe that this family was real, that Thomas was here to stay. And Thomas, with each passing day, found that he could finally let go of the past, finally forgive himself for the years he had lost. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen, Megan paused, a thoughtful look on her face. I feel happy, she said softly, almost as if testing the word on her tongue. I didn't know it could feel like this. Thomas looked at her, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. You deserve to be happy, Megan. We both do. And with that, they embraced, two souls who had wandered through years of heartache and loss, only to find each other again. In that quiet, warm kitchen, they knew that their story had finally come full circle, that they were no longer defined by the empty spaces in their lives, but by the love they had found and the family they had built together. And as they stood there, holding on to each other, they knew that this was only the beginning.